Hi, everybody. This is Dave Detweiler from Safety Chain, and thanks for joining us here on another great FSMA Friday, whether it's a good morning for you if you're on the West Coast or a start of your Friday afternoon here on the East Coast. Thanks for joining us, and we're going to get started here and walk through our presentation with Dr. Acheson. And so, sorry, I was having trouble getting that move in there. Now we're set. So I'm your host, Dave Detweiler. I'm the Vice President of Sales here at Safety Chain. Before we begin, just a couple brief housekeeping notes, right? There will be a recording link that's sent out next week. There is a Q&A button on the right side of your WebEx that our presentation is being hosted with today. As we go through, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those, and we'll address them at the end of our conversation here. You might also have a question, right? You see yourself, and hopefully that's all you see. And the panelists, we do that for security, just so you should only be seeing yourself. If you do have any trouble dialing in or hearing this over your speakers on your computer, you can dial in through the dial-in number provided as well. So without further ado, we're going to start walking through some pre-submitted questions that we have on today's topic. Then we'll follow up on how TAG and Safety Chain can help, and we'll obviously go through the audience Q&A as well. I don't know that I have to do much introduction today, David, but thanks for joining us. Maybe you could say hi to everybody. Happy to have Dr. Acheson with us here today to walk through our FSMA Friday. Hi, David. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to everybody else, too. I look forward to the conversation around sanitary transport.
Perfect. So let's get started. Is there any general, and we do this a lot up front, David, is there any general kind of just FSMA updates or anything that's new at the FDA that we should be aware of before we get into the sanitary transport rule?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. There's a couple of things that are worth mentioning, I think. And then you'd sort of just go down a list in no particular order, but one of the things that's just popped up, I think, in the last couple of days is where's menu labeling going? And I don't want to just take a second on that one because it's not exactly FSMA, but it's closely related. And we kind of speculated that, you know, where's the Trump administration going to go in relation to rolling back food-related regs? And I've always felt this one was the most vulnerable as opposed to the FSMA rules themselves. And just on that note, there's a little traffic just in the last 48 hours about the FDA submitting an interim final rule to the Office of Management and Budget, which is sort of an indication that maybe I think it's May 5th compliance date may get kicked down the road. But nothing definitive on that one. And, you know, frankly, I think the general comment is, well, here it is coming out on April 28th with a May 5th deadline. It's like if you're not ready by now, you're never going to be ready. So I'm not sure that this is really going to have a major impact on people, but it's just something to look out for. Other little things that have popped up, somewhat FSMA related. We've talked in the past about countries that have basically been determined to have equivalent food safety systems as the United States. And New Zealand was the first one several years ago that got that. Canada just recently. And literally within the last month, Australia has joined that list. So we now have New Zealand, Canada, and Australia as countries that have been deemed to have equivalent systems, which just relaxes things a little bit when it comes to getting approvals around some of the food safety criteria that foreign manufacturers, distributors are reaching. I think the only other point that I might mention is that there's been a little chatter about healthy labels. The director at CIFSAN Center Director, has put out a little blog recently around that being a topic of focus. Again, not exactly FSMA related, but all kind of tied in with regulations and where do we put resources and how do we make it all work, which is obviously a theme of these sessions. So with that, Dave, back to you.
Dave, that's some really good information. Do you think, so you mentioned Canada, New Zealand, if I could say it here on Friday, New Zealand, and Australia. Do you see that that's going to be a kind of ongoing trend? Will there be additional countries, do you think, added to that, Dave?
Slowly, yes. I think that there's, in my mind, those were entirely predictable. There is very strong food safety relationships between the U.S., Canada, and obviously the U.S. and Australia and New Zealand, and that's been going on for decades, and there's a very, very close alignment between those countries. I think there's a next tier which might include certain European countries. The UK comes to mind, and then maybe Japan, and then after that, there's like we're a long way away, I think, from equivalence from anywhere else. But they've kind of already, I think, grabbed the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, with the 3 countries that they brought on.
Very cool. Cool insight. All right, so let's move on to why everybody's here, right? This month's discussions around the sanitary transportation rule, right? And Dave, maybe you could give us a little bit of insight on the purpose of the sanitary transport, just at the highest level, and how you see this coming about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing to keep in mind here is there's kind of 2 parts to this: is the purpose of the rule and what it is about. Just to remind everybody that the sanitary transport rule was actually an independent track of rulemaking going back to 2005, when the jurisdiction of the safe transport of food was shifted over to the Food and Drug Administration, and I think that was 2005 that actually happened. I think prior to that it was under the Department of Transport. So all those years ago, the authority to regulate transportation of food got moved over to the FDA, and the FDA really didn't act on it. They didn't write any regulations on it. And when the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in 2011, one small component of that was message to the FDA, okay, you've got this authority. It speaks to keeping food safe, so get a move on and write the regs. And that's part of the reason why it sort of just looked a little different in terms of initially, at least, bringing in some FDA and USDA commodities. That subsequently got cleaned up in the final rule and is very FDA-centric. So what's this fundamentally, what's this rule about? It really is about ensuring that the practices that are being executed with regard to the movement of food is keeping the food safe. So it's heavily focused on proper refrigeration, time temperature controls with regard to hazards, microbiological hazards, production of toxins that are prevented through appropriate time temperature control. That's one very key area. And the second key area is avoiding cross-contamination. And this is really done in 2 main areas of focus, the cross-contamination. One is loads. So in other words, making sure that as you're shipping food, there isn't a risk of an allergen or a chemical cross-contaminating during the actual movement of the food. And the second is the cleanliness of the vehicles or the rail cars themselves. So that's sort of focused on prior history of what's been moved in the trucks, the rail cars, are they clean, and then making sure that food that's being moved around is time temperature controlled. What that does is essentially kick in an enormous amount of food that's moved that, in my way of interpreting this rule, is that you don't need to worry about from a sanitary transport perspective because it doesn't require time temperature. It's sealed. And in essence, if you're moving food that's packaged, sealed, and I mean sealed, if you've got air holes, then that's exposed. But if it's dry goods and it's sealed, boxes of cereal, cans of whatever food that don't require time temperature control, shelf stable, then this rule really doesn't impact you at all. It's very focused on time temperature sensitive foods and cross contamination. So that's what it's about. That's a little bit about its origins and where it came from, and that's where its focus is. I think there's a couple of other points to just keep in mind on this, and that is that it is heavily focused on movement of food in the United States. So that's kind of what the purpose of it is, Dave.
That's insightful, David, and I appreciate that. The idea, though, that when you say cleanliness and things like that, so the majority of it, it sounds like the big focus is on time and temperature, like packaged, sealed containers, like you said. Is there still a cleanliness aspect to each of those, or does that kind of go away as well unless it's just time and temperature?
It really is. I mean, frankly, I think if the FDA saw even packaged goods being hauled around in trailers and rail cars that were filthy, full of holes, then they'd probably have something to say. But the real purpose of this is protecting the food. So if the food is adequately protected, even if the truck isn't particularly clean, one could argue that they wouldn't focus on it, because a transporter could say, well, my truck may be not in the greatest of shape, but the food within it is fine, it's safe, it's protected because it's in a can, it's in cardboard, or it's on pallets or whatever. So it's all a matter of, like all of these rules, is when you try to define black and white, you wind up with lots of grayness. And but the principle, really, the principle is if it can be, with what you're doing to that food as you're moving it, if you can create a food safety risk, then you better fix it. And to your point, you could have even dry packaged goods with a trailer full of rodents, and that would be a problem. So I'm not sort of saying, yeah, you can do anything if it's dry packaged goods. You've got to obviously pay attention to good practices.
Makes a lot of sense, and I think that I think that brings us over to topic number 2, as I should have left that on topic number 1 there, but the idea of what you just said. So who does it, you started talking a little bit about this, David, of who it actually impacts in the compliance states, but maybe you can give us just a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, I mean, the main point that it impacts, and we've just talked about the types of food that it's impacting and what the essence of the rule is all about. And it really is impacting the movement of food within the United States that is in rail cars and in trucks, and it's pretty tight that way. It doesn't. I mean, if you're moving food in the United States on a boat, the rule doesn't apply. It's rail cars and it's trucks, and it's food that is moving around within the U.S. If food arrives from overseas on a ship or an airplane and is then transferred to a truck or a rail car, then it becomes impacted by the rule when it's in the rail car, when it's being moved in the U.S. One of the exceptions, just to mention in that context, is if food is, say, arriving in the port of Los Angeles and is being trucked up to Canada, sealed, not going into commerce within the United States, that would be exempt. So this is sort of all linked to trucks, rail cars moving in the U.S. that is destined for U.S. manufacturing, processing, or consumption. So at a high level, that's what it's about, and it doesn't impact if there's a truck moving food in Vietnam before it's shipped over to the U.S. Then that is not part of where this rule is going. Even though obviously that's something that a wise company would be paying attention to, the rule isn't impacting it.
Got it.
So that's kind of mainly who it's going to hit. Compliance dates, we're already there, which is why this was a topic for this particular webinar, was just to mention that April is the date when you should have been compliant. Sure. If you're not, watch out. It's kind of the message there. I think we'll get into that a bit more in a second.
Yeah, well, I think you started to lead into it, David, giving a good segue into some of the exceptions, right? And what that looks like. I do, as we get into that, David, so I'm assuming you're having some good conversations with companies that are transporting their own product, like back and forth to DCs too. I'm assuming that adds some complexity with this rule, time and temperature and additional oversight.
It does. And I think one of the challenges here is for individuals who are in this rule and like I said, you ask yourself the basic questions about is what I'm doing creating a potential risk that the FDA is going to expect me to control? And the final rule broke the whole system down into 4 categories. You could be a shipper of the food, a loader of the food, a carrier, or a receiver. And some entities may be doing, frankly, maybe all 4. You may be the person who is causing the food to be moved. And that's, in essence, I think, in simple terms, the definition of the shipper. You are causing the food to move from A to B. The loader is kind of obvious. The carrier is obvious, and the receiver is obvious. So you may be causing food to be moved around from a supplier to you, i.e. you're the shipper. You may also have a fleet of vehicles, rail cars, and thus the carrier. You're loading stuff, which makes you the loader, and also you're receiving from your supplier, so you're the receiver. So I think part of people's challenge is what exactly am I, and what do I have to do? And I think, again, in simple terms, my view of this is that the shipper is the one who has the biggest burden. They're the ones that really need to be paying attention to setting the controls and understanding the risks with regard to food. The shipper can dictate to the carrier, here's what I expect you to do. You're moving this product, this commodity from A to B. It's time temperature sensitive. Here's the criteria you need to meet. And that's done through written agreements, which are frankly part of your compliance record for the relationship with the carrier. And I think, to your question, one of the biggest challenges is, well, exactly what am I, and then what do I have to do? You mentioned exemptions, and there are a bunch. And just recently, the FDA came out with some new ones. And they actually, for those of you who are looking at this and in this space, just kind of recently, the FDA came out with a 2-pager, which is kind of helpful in terms of just laying out these key issues. And one of the things that are in there on page 1 is a question: am I covered by this rule? And there's some good information in there if you're just wondering if you are covered. And I've touched on some of this already, but there's the usual financial constraints. If you're basically less than $500,000 in annual revenues, either as a shipper or a carrier or a receiver or a loader, then you're exempt. Interestingly, activities performed by a farm are exempt, even though in my personal view, there's a lot of risk when farms can move food around, but I understand why that is in there. The transshipped component that I've already mentioned, live animals are exempt except shellfish. But some of the recent exemptions for shellfish is it may be under different regulatory requirements that are already controlled. So there are a number of exemptions in here, and my recommendation to anybody is that if you're just questioning whether what you're doing is exempt, then just check out that 2-pager. It's nicely written out, and you can obviously then have a good argument should the FDA come along and say, you should be doing this. And it's like, no, I shouldn't, not based on this exemption that you published. So that's kind of where the exemptions sit, Dave.
It seems quite clear, David. So that, as you said, with every rule, there's some gray area too. So I think reviewing that's obviously wickedly important. What about the waivers and how they might impact some of the companies as you're talking about whether you should or shouldn't?
Yeah, to me, the waivers sort of fit in with the with this new statement that came out of FDA, this sort of guidance. I wouldn't call it a guidance document. It's kind of it's a fact sheet more than anything else. And the original rule did have some waivers in it, and this little fact sheet has got, again, a little section on there about whether or not you're subject to a waiver. And I think there's a few key areas to mention. One is, and let me just put this in context, is I think these waivers really are not waivers to say, well, we don't care about whether you're safe. The fundamental premise is if you're moving food, and if you don't do it correctly, you will create a food safety risk. The waivers are basically saying, well, you're actually covered by another rule. You're not let off the hook for paying attention to food safety. So the waiver isn't an exemption, and I'm not trying to confuse people here. The exemption would be, okay, you just don't need to worry about that. The waiver is saying, let me just use an example, is grade A milk shipments. So there's a waiver associated with those. And that's because, essentially, they're already under an inspection program from the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments. So it's not like you're off the hook. It's like, well, you're already being covered by something else. I mentioned just a few minutes ago about shellfish, and that's another waiver for businesses that are certified and inspected under the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference National Shellfish Sanitation Program. Is a mouthful. So it's not like shellfish are considered, we don't need to worry about it. Yeah, we do, big time, but if you're certified and inspected under a different program, then you can get a waiver. There's also some other waivers that are related to small food establishments, retail, food service type operations, food that's being directly delivered to consumers by authorized establishments, and these get waivers because they're essentially under the jurisdiction of local health authorities or state health authorities. So that's kind of in a nutshell. The waivers is if you're under the grade A milk, if you're local and you're being regulated by the local health authorities, if you're shellfish and you're being regulated by the Interstate Shellfish Program, then those are considered waivers. But again, to emphasize, if you are claiming a waiver, if you're saying, well, I don't need to be compliant with this rule because I have a waiver, make sure that you've basically got the certificates and the inspection records from the program that you believe is affording you the waiver, because the FDA may well come in and say, well, okay, I get that, but where's your certification to show that you're meeting this program? As just to sort of assume that because you move shellfish, you're okay. You do need the appropriate inspection records from the alternate authority. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but it's important to recognize exemption versus waiver.
Well, and it sounds like waiver is quite positive, I'm assuming, for a bunch of people on the phone, because what it means is you don't have to duplicate effort, right? We understand you're complying in this fashion, and to your point, as long as you have the proper documentation, it should be pretty well set.
Yeah, no, exactly, and you've got it. Don't be duplicating, and there's a lot of FSMA around that. They really have tried to, I think, reduce duplication, so you don't need to keep two sets of records. So yeah, no, exactly. Yep.
Sure. All right, so now we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty here, David, as we round the corner. So if I am right, and I fall under one of the categories, what, from a compliance standpoint, what do we need, right? What do I need to do?
Well, I've already mentioned a little bit, Dave, about the shippers, and the shippers are the entity that's causing the food to be moved, and you really do need to get a lot of stuff in writing and figure out where your risks are, and your notification to the carriers around here's what you need to do to control those risks. So the shipper has to put a lot of stuff in writing. Again, there's a lot of details and a lot of exceptions in that, in terms of what the carrier is doing. But I think the point here is make sure that you've got the relationship with the carrier, and the carrier understands what they need to do. And this could include time temperature controls. It can include the procedures for sanitation of the trucks, making sure that they're clean, that there's a record of that. So as I mentioned earlier, the shipper I think, has the biggest burden here. The loaders are really essentially doing what they're told by the shippers. The loaders have this, in essence, a simple responsibility of making sure that the truck is meeting the requirements. Is it physically intact? Is it free of pest infestation? Is there any evidence that the previous cargo is going to create a risk? So that's kind of the role of the loader. And again, the way the rule is written, and my interpretation of it is that the loader needs to keep records of those specific things. So on a given date, with a given load, on a given truck, they can go back and say, yep, we checked, and we checked all the boxes. The receiver is the person who has the least to worry about, and by definition, a receiver is the person who receives the food. That's very clear and obvious. I think the biggest job for the receiver is, and frankly, this is standard business practice anyway, is to check that the food looks like it's not had a time temperature abuse. And that can be done through essentially visual inspections. The rule talks about just, does it look like it's in trouble? Does it smell weird? I mean, very, very sort of subjective type measurements. You can certainly temp check the food, but there's nothing in the rule that says you need to temp check every single case on every single pallet.
Sure.
But again, I think keeping records, which is standard good practice, that the receipt is the food is not posing a risk. The final category, so we've talked about the shippers and the loaders, the receivers. The carrier is again, by definition, the person who's moving the food around. We've talked about that the carrier and the shipper will likely have an agreement about what the carrier needs to do. They have a responsibility, the carrier, that they're meeting the shipper's specifications, and that the vehicle they're using, whether it be a rail car or not, is meeting those specifications. A slightly new twist to this for the carriers is essentially a need for carriers to be trained in food safety, and that's a new feature that's come into this rule, and essentially where the FDA is saying, well, we're going to be putting out some information about what we believe is appropriate, and the carrier needs to understand these food safety risks that I've talked about. So they need to understand the basics of cleanliness, cross-contamination, time temperature controls. The carriers need to be trained, and that training needs to be documented. There isn't a recognized FDA training program yet. I think they will get some information out of the FDA eventually about, here's what they recommend be in that course. But it's kind of self-obvious, I think, and I've just kind of stated it, is make sure that the individuals understand the fundamentals of food safety and what we're trying to do here: time temperature, cross-contamination, truck cleanliness. That training is completed, and that there's records that it's been completed. I suspect that there'll be all sorts of people will offer carrier training, and I think from a risk perspective, you just make sure that this training is meeting those basic criteria until we get more clarity and guidance from the FDA. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, Dave, but that's a bit about the shippers and the loaders, the carriers and the receivers, because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road on this rule. And if you're not sure what you are, take a look at that little two-pager that I've mentioned. It's pretty helpful.
It's, and the information is quite helpful, David. The question I think everybody's wondering is, okay, so, how aggressive, and you mentioned the administration and changes and, things coming out. I mean, how aggressive are they going to, do you think, they'll be enforcing this rule?
Well, it's the FDA have signaled that with a lot of FSMA, they're going to educate and then regulate. And that's good to hear. I think they've recognized that there's a lot of education that needs to be done here, and I think everybody in the private sector is saying, well, yeah, it's not just educate of us on the private side, it's educating inspectors as well. And I think that's that the FDA recognized that they've got a lot of training to do with their own people. So the message that I'm hearing is yeah, the compliance date is here. It was in April, so it's this month on the sanitary transport rule. Legally, from a regulatory perspective, you need to have all this up and running, but we recognize that you may not be quite there yet. But be on a good path, a good trajectory, and the FDA is going to be gentle, at least to begin with. This has been echoed in the way they're talking about implementing requirements for the preventive control rule as well. Is like, okay, we're going to move slowly, and I think fundamentally what I'm hearing here is that if the FDA is showing up to check whether you're compliant with the sanitary transport rule, and if you're not, they will not be issuing 483s right out of the gate. Now, don't quote me on that, because every inspector has a right to do that, and but the message from the agency is that's not what we're going to do. We're not trying to get a high list of gotchas. But, and this is a very important but, if they do come in and look at this program and find gaps and holes, and they do educate, if when they come back, however long that is, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, if you have not got there, if you have not filled the gaps that they found, you will get a 483. That's my view, is that they'll kind of give you one opportunity to get it right, at least in the next 12 months or so. And then if you haven't got it right on a return visit, you'll be in trouble. So we'll see, but keep in mind that the compliance dates are the compliance dates, and the FDA have the legal authority to be able to enforce those. And time will tell, and stories will unfold.
That's the fun of it, right, Dave? It's an ongoing story that we're all living through, for sure.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
It keeps us coming back, right, Dave? If it was the same all the time, it would be boring. I mean, that's what happens, right? Otherwise, at least we're all not bored. That's for
exactly.
sure. And I think we can finish this up with, any suggestions you might have, if a company's not quite ready yet. I heard you mention a couple of things, make sure your documentation's in place, make sure that, if you have a waiver, that your certifications are in place. Is there anything that, companies should be focusing on, let's say, if they're not ready?
Yeah, I mean, I think like much of FSMA, the important thing is even if you aren't quite there yet, have a good story to tell. Understand whether you are a shipper, a carrier, a loader, or a receiver, and which of those, and is it one of the four, is it all four, or some combination, so that you're able to have a conversation with an inspector of like, yeah, I know I'm a shipper, I've got this done, I don't have all the paperwork yet done with the carriers, I don't have this documented completely yet, but we're heading in that direction. So that you're able to tell the story of you get it, you understand the principles of what it's about, you've determined which foods need to be under this, you've built the required paperwork with, I don't know, 50% of your carriers, you have a few more left to go, so you're almost there. I mean, that's the kind of message that I think is important. What won't work is the conversation if, like, what do you mean I need to pay attention to this rule? I've never heard of it. And obviously nobody on this webinar is going to be saying that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But so I think that's a general FSMA mantra message that I think is important, is be able to have good conversations with regulators about where you are on the trajectory of compliance, even if you're not quite there. So an inspector feels like, number one, this entity gets it. Number two, they've put in effort, they're moving forward, they're heading in the right direction. And number three, they're going to get there. So I think those are the three key elements if you're not quite there. And I would just extend that concept to FSMA, period, not just the sanitary transport rule, Dave.
I think that's a fair statement, right? Showing good progress. You've talked a lot about that in the past, and that you are actively working towards it, right? I think that
Yeah.
So this is a big task too. And but I think a lot of companies that are on the phone, you know, especially with us today, as I'm looking at the group, you probably have a lot of these things in place too. So the conversation was great, Dave. And let me open this up. If I can take everybody out of full screen view, excuse me, and just see if we had any questions and comments that come in. So you can obviously go to QA, the question and answer frame down at the bottom. You can submit your questions. As we do that, and as we see some of these questions queuing up, I will just give you a brief summary on David too, right? And David, working for the Acheson group, does a great job in helping you know, talk the FSMA game for sure, right? And spending the time and understanding how it impacts you if you are affected by the exceptions, how to get your items in order for your organization as well. And we always appreciate David's time as he's on the call with us today. So thanks again for that, David. And you can see here, if you want to contact the Acheson group, you can email lindsay.nix@theachesongroup.com. So thanks again, David, for your time for sure. I do have one question that came in as we kind of wrap this up here, David. One question that came in is she had said, as a shipper in most situations, the carrier is set up by the receiver. Do I need to ask to see the agreement the receiver has with the carrier? Is that kind of how you were talking about this, David? And does that question make sense?
If I'm understanding the question right, Dave, is this, I'm assuming this person is a shipper, and they're wondering if they need to see the agreement between the carrier and the receiver.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's the exact question.
Okay, I don't believe you do. No, I think that's I think there is the receiver has an obligation in their own right. They are receiving goods that require time temperature control, and they have to basically document that it was received in good order and that it looked like it had met the criteria. So that's a relationship between the carrier and the receiver. Obviously, the receiver, if the goods are messed up, will be having a conversation with the carrier and likely the shipper too. So you're going to hear about it. But no, I don't believe that there is a requirement in the rule for the shippers to have any insights into the contracts and the arrangements between the carriers and the receivers.
Got it. That's perfect. And we're getting a couple of these good gray area questions. As I go to another question here, Dave, which I'll kick over to you, obviously I'm from Safety Chain Software. We are the ones that are also producing the FSMA Fridays, and just wanted to point out that some of the items that you've heard about today in data and record capture and the idea of having a system or a technology be utilized for this is something that Safety Chain does quite well. So again, thanks for everybody's time. David, I do have another question here. Does the shipper loader need the compliance documents from the carrier? Is the question that comes in. So shipper loader need the compliance documents from the carrier.
I think the shipper, with the exception of what we talked about in relation to does the shipper need to have insight into the contract between the carrier and the receiver, the shipper needs to make sure that the carrier is following the right criteria that the shipper has set. And this can be done contractually, I believe. So the shipper basically sets the guidelines, sets the rules. Here's what I expect you to do, carrier, in terms of controlling risks. I don't believe there's any expectation in the rule itself that the shipper is going to be overseeing all the carrier's practices. I mean, one could translate that question into, does the shipper have to check that all the carrier's personnel are trained? I don't think that would be the expectation from the FDA. I think the carrier has got responsibility to make sure that their trucks are in order and that the training is done. Does the shipper have to make sure that training is done? I don't think so. That would be my interpretation of this. And like everything else in FSMA, it's like you can go crazy and you can be like spending hours and hours and hours and mountains of paperwork to pull all this together. And my recommendation at this stage, without having lots of clear guidance on the expectations or in inspection history is do what you think you need to do to meet the compliance, basic compliance requirements as the shipper. And while we could say, yeah, you know, you need all this information on the carrier, my advice right now is no, don't go there. That creates work for you as the shipper. It creates work for the carrier, and we'll see if that's going to be the expectation. But my view is that without that, you're putting the burden on the carrier, and you may put that in a contract. Hey, carrier, you need to be compliant with all the FSMA requirements, and the contractor signs that and says, yep, I'll do that, and then leave them to do it, rather than creating yet more work, yet more issues, yet more challenges, and there aren't the resources to do all of that, and frankly, it isn't really controlling risk anyway. So I think you just put it in the contract and make sure the carrier is doing what he's supposed to do.
Perfect. And I know that I know we had scheduled this for 30 minutes, David, and we're about 10 minutes over. I will end with one more question for you, if you don't mind. I think this is a good question. Any of the questions that aren't answered will be posted out to our FSMA Fridays LinkedIn group. So all of you that are out there that have joined, thanks. Any of you here haven't, please do. It's a good place to catch up and talk FSMA-related activity. So Dave, how about we end with one more question. And this was something that you specifically had said, you know, time temperature you were talking about. And the question is, if a product is shipped refrigerated for quality purposes, not food safety reasons, does that still fall under the reg, or is this just specifically for food safety purposes?
Great question. And my read on that one is, if it's quality, you're okay. Some of the early versions of the rule, the proposed rule, had got language in there that if you were shipping it and controlling, let me get tongue-tied here. If you had time temperature requirements for quality purposes, this is in the early versions of the rule, then that fell under the rule. The final rule, my read of it, is that was taken out. So if you are time temperature controlling for quality purposes, then I think you're fine. You don't need to go through the same hoops. But look at that very carefully, and if you feel like, well, actually there's a little bit of safety in this, then you are under the rule. But if it's pure quality, then my read of the rule right now is no, you don't need to be compliant. It doesn't fall under the rule.
David, thanks again so much for your time today. As everybody, you know, took their time out today, for everybody online, thank you so much for being here. It was wildly informative, David, and we always appreciate your time. Thanks for going through it. For those of you whose questions didn't get answered, like I said, we will post them out to LinkedIn to give you some responses. And so please join that LinkedIn group. And obviously, as you're around, look up the Acheson group or safetychain.com. And thanks everybody for your time today, and have a wonderful weekend. Thanks again, David.
Very good. All right. Thanks, everybody.